The remaining mourners waited comfortably in the sun, talking to each other like members of a recreational society. Together they formed a cross-section of the expatriate business community: hoteliers and restaurateurs, a taxi company proprietor, two satellite dish agents, a cancer specialist from the Princess Margaret Clinic, property developers, bar owners, and investment counselors. Looking at their sleek and suntanned faces, it struck me as curious that there was no one present of Bibi Jansen's age, for all the talk of her popularity. Nodding my respects to the Keswick sisters, I left the main party of mourners and walked towards the graves below the rear wall. Here, as if deliberately holding herself apart from the others, stood a tall, strong-shouldered woman in her late 50s, platinum hair tightly crowned by a wide-brimmed black straw hat. No one seemed willing to approach her, and I sensed that a formal invitation was needed merely to bow. Behind her, serving as her baby-faced bodyguard, was the bar steward from the Club Nautico, Sonny Gardner, his yacht rigger's shoulders constrained by a smart gray jacket. I knew this was Elizabeth Shand, Estrella Demar's most successful businesswoman, a former partner of Hollinger's. She now controlled a web of companies in the property and service sectors. Her eyes surveyed the mourners with the ever-watchful but tolerant gaze of a governor at a light regime prison for executive criminals. As if keeping up a private commentary on her charges, her lips murmured to themselves in an almost louche way, and I saw her as part martinet, part bawdy housekeeper, the most intriguing of all combinations. I knew that she was a major shareholder in the Club Nautico and a close colleague of Frank's, and was about to introduce myself when her eyes moved sharply from the grieving Swede and fixed themselves on a late arrival at the cemetery. Her mouth opened with a rictus of such distaste that I expected the mauve lipstick to peel from the irritated skin. Sanger? Good God, the man's got nerve. Sonny Gardner stepped forward, buttoning his jacket. Do you want me to see him off, Mrs. Shand? No. Let him know what we think of him. The sheer neck of it. A slim, silver-haired man in a tailored tropical suit was making his way over the rough ground, his slender hands parting the air. He moved with light but delicate but deliberate steps, his eyes searching the diagram of stones around him. His handsome face was smooth and feminine, and he had the easy manner of a stage hypnotist, but he was clearly conscious of the hostile mourners stirring around him. His faint smile seemed almost wistful, and he now and then lowered his head, like a sensitive man aware that because of some minor quirk of character, he had never been liked. Clasping his hands behind his back, he positioned himself at the graveside, the soil breaking under his patent leather shoes. I assumed that he was the Swedish pastor of some obscure Lutheran sect to which Bibi Jansen had belonged, and that he was about to officiate at her interment. Is this the pastor? I asked Gardner, whose flexing arms threatened to split the seams of his jacket. He's rather curiously dressed. Is he going to bury her? Some say he already has. Gardner cleared his throat, looking for somewhere to spit. Dr. Erwin Sanger, Bibi's psychiatrist, the one mad person in the whole of Estrella Demar. I listened to the cicadas rasping while the mourners stared with varying degrees of hostility at the silver-haired newcomer, and reminded myself that there were far more tensions below the surface of this charming beach resort than first seemed apparent. Elizabeth Shand was still staring at the psychiatrist, clearly disputing his right to be present. Protected by her baleful presence, I raised my camera and began to photograph the mourners. No one spoke as the sounds of the motor drive echoed off the walls. I knew they disapproved of the camera, as they did of my continued presence at Estrella Demar. Watching the mourners through the viewfinder, it occurred to me that almost all of them would have attended the Hollingers' party on the evening of the fire. Most were members of the Club Nautico and knew Frank well. None, I had been relieved to find, accepted that he was guilty. Every morning since my first visit to Estrella Demar, I had driven from the Los Monteros Hotel, carrying out my detective investigation. I canceled my TV assignment in Helsinki and telephoned to my agent in London, Rodney Lewis, asking him to put all other commitments on hold. Does that mean you've found something? He asked. Charles? No, I've found absolutely nothing. But you think it's worth staying out there? The trial won't start for several months. Even so, it's an unusual place. So is Torquay. You must have some idea what happened. No, to tell the truth, I haven't. I'll stay here, though. Nothing I had found gave me the slightest hint of why my brother, at home and at ease for the first time in his life, should have turned into an arsonist and murderer. But if Frank had not set fire to the Hollinger mansion, who had? I asked David Hennessy for a list of his fellow guests at the party, but he refused point blank, claiming that Inspector Cabrera might charge other guests with the crime if Frank withdrew his confession, and perhaps incriminate the entire community. The Keswick sisters told me that they had attended the Queen's birthday parties for years. They had been standing by the pool when the flames erupted through the bedroom windows, and left with the first stampede of guests to their cars. Anthony Bevis, owner of the Cabo d'Oro Gallery and a close friend of Roger Sansom, claimed that he had tried to force the French window but had been driven back by the exploding tiles that were leaping from the roof. Colin Dewhurst, manager of a bookshop in the Plaza Iglesias, had helped the Hollingers' chauffeur to carry a ladder from the garage, only to watch the upper rungs catch fire in the intense blaze. None of them had seen Frank slip into the house with his lethal flagons of ether and petrol, or could conceive of any reason why he might want to kill the Hollingers. I noticed, however, that of the 30 people I questioned, not one suggested any other suspect. Something told me that if his friends really believed in Frank's innocence, they would have hinted at the identity of the true assassin. Estrella Demar seemed a place without shadows, its charms worn as openly as the bare breasts of the women of all ages who sunbathed at the Club Nautico. Secure on their handsome peninsula, the people of the resort were an example of the liberation that follows when continuous sunlight is shone on the British. I could understand why the residents were less than keen for me to write about their private paradise, and already I was beginning to see the town through their eyes. Once I had freed Frank from prison, I would buy an apartment of my own and make it my winter base. In many ways, Estrella Demar was the halcyon county town England of the mythical 1930s, brought back to life and moved south into the sun. Here there were no gangs of bored teenagers, no deracinated suburbs where neighbors scarcely knew each other and their only civic loyalties were to the nearest hypermarket and DIY store. As everyone never tired of saying, Estrella Demar was a true community, with schools for the French and British children, a thriving Anglican church, and a local council of elected members which met at the Club Nautico. However, modestly, a happier 20th century had rediscovered itself in this corner of the Costa del Sol. The only shadow cast across its plazas and avenues was the fire at the Hollinger house. In the late afternoon, when the sun moved behind the peninsula and set off towards Gibraltar, the silhouette of the gutted mansion crept along the palm-lined streets, darkening the pavements and the walls of the villas below, silently wrapping the town in its somber shroud. As I stood among the graves beside Elizabeth Shand and waited for the casket of the young Swedish woman, it occurred to me that Frank might have pleaded guilty in order to save Estrella Demar from being overrun by British and Spanish police, or by private detectives hired by relations of the Hollinger family. This innocence of crime might even explain the voyeuristic gaze of the people I had caught in the floodlights of the Club Nautico car park. Never having seen a rape, they had watched the assault as if it were some folkloric or pagan rite from a more primitive world.